And we're going to be in Genesis chapter 3 today, but we're going to get there after a while. So just keep your thumb back there in the beginning on page number 3, and we'll get there eventually. It is fall weather out there. Anybody else happy about this? This is my favorite, thank you, yes. Favorite season by far is fall, autumn. I mean, you get everything with it. You get the beautiful weather. You get the beautiful leaves out on the trees. You get football on Friday nights. How about that Edwards County win? I know some of you care about that. And then we also get scary movies, haunted houses. Anybody going to go pay somebody else to get scared? Anybody going to do that lately? There's a movie coming out that I'm excited about. The remake or the new sequel for the Halloween movie from the 1980s. I'm excited for that. Anybody else going to go pay to get scared, right? Now, did you know that the different horror movies, the different scary movies throughout history, they reflect our own fears? And that's why they're so good. That's why we care about them, is because they reflect a genuine fear you have, and they represent it or personify it in a movie. So here's a couple examples of that. Godzilla, have we seen these movies? The Japanese scary movies with the giant monster terrorizing the cities, Tokyo. That's personifying the nuclear bomb bombing them and this fallout and this destruction from it. They're afraid of that. And Americans, we have a similar genre of movies from the 50s. We have these alien invasion movies with War of the Worlds, right? That's the fear of Russia or of Korea going to come and bomb us and just destroy us completely. Or a little bit later, we have, before this, really back in the 1930s, we have the Great Depression happening, and so we get King Kong along with that. And then fast forward a little bit later into the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and you see a lot of movies, scary movies about religious figures, about the cult, and anybody see The Omen or Rosemary's Baby or things like that, or The Exorcist? And it's kind of our fear of religious damnation or fear of demonic possession or things like that. And then in the early 2000s, this new genre of scary movies really boosted into popularity. It's been around, but it really got more popular, the zombie genre. Anybody watch any zombie movies in the last 20 years? And this comes from the fear of terrorism. That's why people like this. After 9/11, people were afraid that there's just going to be this event that happens and just sends everybody into social disorder. That's what zombies represent. And so we have these things that represent fears for us, and now they put them in movies. And you guys know the name Stephen King, right? He's the king of horror movies, the king of scary stories. And he talks about the different fears that he puts into his stories. And he says there's 3 different levels of fears. He says the first one is the gross out. It's the sight of a severed head tumbling down a flight of stairs. It's when the lights go out and something green and slimy splatters against your arm, the gross out. And then there's the horror. And this is the unnatural, the spiders that are the size of bears, or the dead waking up, walking around. It's when the lights go out and something with claws grabs you by the arm. And then the last and the worst is terror. When you come home and you notice that everything you own had been taken away and replaced by an exact substitute, and it's when the lights go out and when you feel something behind you, you hear it, you feel its breath against your ear, and when you turn around, there's nothing there. That's the different levels of fear that Stephen King talks about that scare us. Now, you want to hear some truth? We don't need to go pay somebody to make us scared. We don't need to go to a haunted house. We don't need to go to the scary movie, because we have genuine fears in our lives. Anybody else follow along? We have fears of what our children are going to do. I have 2 friends who just had both baby boys, and I know if I'm a parent, I'm going to be terrified that, I got this kid, I am responsible for this child. Not only its physical life, but its spiritual life. I have to instill God in this child. That's a scary thought. Or maybe you're scared about your financial situation. You're just unsure. Or you're scared that somebody's going to find you out. You're scared of, the list goes on. We have very real fears. And so what we're going to do for the next 4 weeks, for the rest of September, as I get ready for October and get excited about October, we're going to talk about different Old Testament stories and look at the fears that these stories show us. And so we're going to start out today with Adam and Eve and their fear. And there's really not much to fear in the beginning, so their fear is of God. They have the fear of God. And now here's the reality with this fear of God. If we get this one right, then we don't have any other fears, okay? If we get this one right, then we don't have to fear anything else. Nothing else will matter. If it's scary, traumatizing, it won't affect us in the same way. If we fear God in the right way, here's where I get that truth from. Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If we get this right, everything else will fall into place. So let's look at Adam and Eve and how they fear God. But before we can look at what's going on with Adam and Eve and their specific story, we see different levels. Where Stephen King talks about different levels of horror or terror or fear in his stories, in our relation to God, there are different ways that we fear Him in relation to our love. So there's different ways that we relate to God with our fear and our love. And so here's the first one I want to look at. There's no fear and there's no love. Anybody know somebody like this? They could not care less about God, Christianity. They just, it's whatever. I'm not dealing with that. They have no fear of God and no love of God. I mean, they just want to avoid it. They just don't want to have anything to do with God. Now, there's a couple different ways that people exemplify this no fear and no love. It's either the defiant, I'm actively going against this. I am fighting against this. I'm marching against Christianity. It is not right. And so you're actively and antagonistically going against Jesus, going against God and saying, no, this isn't right. I'm rebelling against this. This is a way that we see no fear and no love, where people actively rebelling against this. And it's kind of, God in your face if you exist. That's what people are saying with this. We have no love, no fear, and just are mean about it. Now here's a verse to describe that. This is in Romans. Paul writes about some pagan people. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. And there is no fear of God before their eyes. Anybody know somebody like that? Where they actively fight against Christianity, actively fight against God, and they rebel, and they just participate in wickedness just to participate in it. They don't fear God, they don't love God, they don't have any reason to follow this moral guidelines that we have, so they rebel and they fight against, and they do everything that we would say you're not supposed to do. So that's defiant rebellion, but there's also just kind of the apathetic rejection. We also see this, where people just don't care. They're indifferent. If God's there, then whatever. I'm not going to deal with them. He's over there. I'm over here. There's no interaction. There's no connection between the two of us. These people are just whatever. Go with the flow. Here's Jeremiah 6:15. He describes the people like this. Were they ashamed whenever they committed abominations? Whenever they sinned, did they get ashamed by it? No. They were not at all ashamed. They did not know how to blush. They got no moral standpoint. They don't care about God. They don't worry about God. They don't wonder what's going to happen if they do this. They just do it and don't care. This is a way that people don't love God and don't fear God. Now, this makes me think of people who take pictures like this. In case you can't see, those are grizzly bears in the background. Do you know what grizzly bears do to humans? They kill humans. You know what they say whenever you are in grizzly territory? If you see a grizzly, hunker down at a ball so that his first swipe doesn't take out all your internal organs. I don't want to be around a grizzly bear. I need to have a healthy fear of a grizzly bear. Anybody else? Right now, I want you to know I have grizzly bears on my socks. You can ask me about it later. But you should have a healthy fear of grizzly bears, right? Amen? Anybody else with me? It'd be foolish. Anybody think that guy's dumb? With me right there? It would be dumb to stand before God with no fear of Him. No conscience, no thought about what's going to happen, no thought towards what the repercussions of your life will be. We commend fearless people a lot of times, right? We say, hey, that's good, not having any fear. But in reality, it's not bravery, it's stupidity to stand before God, to stand before a grizzly bear with no fear. It's a healthy fear. That's what's good for you. Now, some people have no love and no fear of God. Now, some people have no fear of God, but they've got some love for God. We know some people like this. I'll tell you that right now. With people who have no fear of God, but they want to be buddy-buddy with God, right? They want to have God on their side. And yeah, this is my pal, Jesus. He's a good guy. Put his face on a T-shirt, and he's my best friend. Anybody watch the movie Talladega Nights? In the movie Talladega Nights, it's about a race car driver, Ricky Bobby. He gets around the dinner table and he's going to pray. And what does he pray to? Dear Lord, baby Jesus. Little baby Jesus in the manger. Not Jesus, the ferocious, mighty warrior, but the little guy in the manger. Just this little innocent. He's not scary. He's just there to be loved. And they ask him, why do you always got to pray to little baby Jesus? He says, I just like the Christmas Jesus more. Right? Anybody else like the Christmas Jesus more than the scary Jesus? And so we have no fear of God, but we have this love of God where we just... Anybody like Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? I grew up on that show. They have a documentary out about him that I want to go watch. Okay, a great man, kind man, taught millions of children, multiple generations about kindness, about love, about tenderness. But that's not what God is. Okay, we want God to be this nice and just put His arm around you and it's like, I got you. Don't worry about it. And He'll talk to you nicely. God may do that, but Fred Rogers, that's all he is. And that's not all God is. That's not all God is. We like Jesus, we like God to just be nice to us all the time and not to punish us. Anybody got a parent that spanked them? Here's this verse. This is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. The Lord disciplines. What does discipline mean? He spanks them, swats them, lets them know that they're wrong. He acts mean towards them maybe. Anybody else think their dad's mean to them when they spank them? Just me? Okay. The Lord disciplines the ones He loves, chastises every son whom He receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? Whenever my dad got down, Clayton, go into my bedroom, get on the bed, I'll be there in a minute. And what he does is he sits me on his lap and says, Clayton, I love you, and then he spanks me. That doesn't feel like love to me, right? Anybody else with me? We like it's okay, Clayton, you'll get better next time. But that's not what God is. And so if we have no fear of God, no fear of getting spanked, but we have love for Him, and then whenever we do get spanked, what happens? Say, God, what's wrong with you? That must have been... And we get the wrong idea about God. We get the wrong perception about what God is. And now, I talked about Jesus being a little baby, and we like to just... He's cute and cuddly. We like to love on Him, but we're not afraid of Him. And then people have, in my opinion, taken this a step too far in worship music. Okay? So I'm going to read some worship lyrics to you from more contemporary music. And I just want you to feel the uncomfortableness that I feel whenever I read these and whenever I'm in a church service and I hear them sang. It just makes me feel uncomfortable. Here's some of these. Friend of sinners, Lord of truth, I have fallen in love with you. Kisses from heaven. I want to lavish my love on you. My words may be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you. Or this one, I long to be in your arms. No one loves me the way you do. Anybody else just weirded out by that? Or people have no fear of Jesus but have this overwhelming love of Jesus. Love is good, but it needs to be in balance with fear. And if you have no fear and love, it gets into this weird territory. So I'm going to read just a few verses to hopefully get your mind, get us into the right perspective to God's somebody to be feared. Jesus is somebody to be feared. Jesus isn't just a little guy in a manger who's cute and cuddly. He is a ferocious warrior, a gladiator. Here's this description. This is Revelation chapter 19. He says, verse 12, His eyes are like a flame of fire. That doesn't sound cuddly to me. And His head are many diadems. He has the name written that no one knows but Himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. I don't want to cuddle with that, do you? It just seems weird. A robe dipped in blood, and the name by which He is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, following Him on white horses. He has an army behind Him. I'm not about to go cuddle up with the general of an army. And from His mouth comes a sharp sword, not very cuddly in my mind. A sharp sword. What does the sharp sword do? He will, to which strike down the nations. He will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. That's not, those worship songs, those are Jesus is my boyfriend songs. That's not much of a boyfriend if you ask me. That's a terrifying, ferocious warrior in battle. So we need to have some love, but if it has no fear with it, then we get into trouble. Some people have no fear, no love. Some people have a little bit of love, but no fear of God. And then some people have the opposite problem. Some people have the opposite problem where they have some fear, but they don't have any love of Jesus or love of God. They fear Him, but they don't love Him. They don't want to be lovey-dovey with God. They just want Him to be out in the distance somewhere. Now, some of us may have this faith. You might love God. You might feel like you have an obligation. Instead of loving God and coming to church because you love God, you come to church because, well, God said so, or because Grandma said so. And you better listen to Grandma, otherwise she'll swat you, right? I mean, we have some of this in our lives. And it's a common, I think more in the past, it was more of a common conversion method. Come to Jesus, be a Christian so you don't go to hell, right? There's no love in there. That's a fear only. I don't want to go to hell, so I better be a Christian. Now, imagine this for a second. You're taking a family vacation, you go down to Florida, okay? And you don't want to go to the interstates because you're like me, and so you drive just the little state highways, U.S. highways back. And you get into Kentucky and southern Indiana, coming back across, and you're going through little tiny towns, and you come up to a town, and you come to a stoplight. And you sit there at the stoplight, and the light is red. And you sit there, and the light is red. And you sit there, and it's still red. A minute goes by, and it's still red. And so you creep forward a little bit, and you look around. There's no cars around. All the lights in the town are off. It's 3 a.m. The kids are asleep in the back. Red light, nobody coming. It's staying red for way too long. So what do? You just creep forward, turn on, you go on your merry way. But as soon as you do that, what happens? The red and blue lights come up behind you, right? It's a trap. They planned that. That red light they planned it being way too long, and the cop sat right there. They did this on purpose. Anybody else? And whenever the cop pulls you over, you going to go give him a hug? Anybody given a hug to a cop when they pulled you over? No. Here's my license and registration. Please don't shoot me. Anybody else? We like to think of God a lot of times as a police officer. We want him out there. Anybody else want the cops out there protecting the people? Want them out there arresting the bad guys? But please don't come around me, right? I don't want the cops at my door because that means I did something wrong, right? I want the cops over at my neighbor's house who are doing something wrong. The Grahams? That's you guys. Right? We don't want them around us. We want them somewhere else. We have no love for the cops, but we have a fear of the cops. Yeah, I want you around. We need you to protect the people, but don't hang out with me. That's how we look at God. That's how we view God a lot of the time. They keep you safe, but please at a distance only. That's how we feel about God. Listen to this verse, James chapter 2, verse 19. The demons believe, and they shudder. That's an example of people, of things, of creatures that have no love for God, but they have fear of God. Now, that what you want? You know where the demons are going? The bottomless pit in hell, tortured forever. That's where they're ending up. That's what happens whenever you have no love of God, but you have some fear of God. And it's just not going to end well for us. It's going to end the same way that the demons are ending. They believe, they understand, but they're afraid, but they don't have any love. So some people have no love and no fear. Some people have love but no fear. And some people have a fear but they don't have any love. But our characters that we're going to look at today, Adam and Eve, they are people that have a healthy fear and an intimate love for God. And that's how we should be acting. We have a healthy fear and an intimate love. You need both of them to work together. You can't have just one or none because things just don't work out for you. You need both of them working together. Now, listen to this verse. This is Romans again, chapter 2. Do you presume on the riches of His kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing, listen to this, not knowing that His kindness is meant to lead you to repentance. God's love, God's kindness for you is supposed to lead you to repentance. So love is good, you need that, but you also need the fear. And so I'm going to look at the fear more than the love that we see in that verse, because that's what we're talking about. That's what the series is about. And that's what we get to see in Adam and Eve. So here's a couple different ways that fear affects us. Here's the good part of it. Fear motivates obedience, right? Fear motivates obedience. Clayton, don't eat the goldfish out of the nursery, otherwise I will spank you. That never happened. Right? Anybody else? Your parent gives you a rule, don't do this or I will spank you. God says, don't do this or I will spank you. That fear of being spanked, that motivates obedience. Not going to do that. I understand that. That makes sense to me. And this is what happens with Adam and Eve. If you look in Genesis chapter 2, whenever God says, hey, you got this beautiful garden, eat anything you want, but, verse 17, Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. You shall surely die. Now it instills a little bit of fear in Adam and Eve. Don't eat that, otherwise I'll die. Make sense? I shouldn't do that because then I will die. That will not be good for me. It won't go well for me. It's the same idea. The fear of getting pulled over keeps you from speeding. Some of us, right? A healthy fear keeps us from doing wrong. But here's the problem with that. Anybody been more motivated by your desire for pleasure than your fear of punishment? Anybody else? How about Adam and Eve? How about every time you sin? Where you understand there is a punishment for this, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to go ahead anyway. I'm going to do that no matter what because and here's what I think is going on. The very real, you can see the pleasure possibility, that is overwhelmingly real. That is realistic, that is tangible. You can see that, you can touch it, and you can experience it. But the fear of being punished, that's still in the abstract. That's still in the, I don't really know what that is. So in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, God says to Adam and Eve, you don't eat it, you shall surely die. Now, Adam and Eve at this point, they don't know what death is. Has anything died in the garden yet? No. Have they died? No. Have they seen any animals die? No. Everything's perfect still. There's no death in the world. And God says, hey, don't eat it, you'll die. And they say, okay, what's that? And then the same idea with Noah. He says, hey, it's going to rain. They say, what's rain? It's never done that before. It's too abstract. We don't understand that. We can't comprehend that. But this pleasure is very real right in front of us. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, delight to the eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Fear motivates obedience, but not very well, because that pleasure is more real, more tangible to us. So fear is a good thing, and it motivates obedience, but anybody else find yourself more listening to the desires of your flesh rather than the fear of God? Or this thing looks fun, this thing looks good, I'm going to do that, and that's going to be a good thing for me rather than not doing it, rather than fearing God. So that's the good. Fear motivates obedience, but it's just not very good at it. It does it, but not necessarily the best. Now here's the bad. Fear, it's the product of guilt. Fear is the product of guilt, right? So anybody done something wrong in your life before? And then your parents find out about it and you got that guilty feeling? Anybody else? Now, I used to ride the school bus to school, okay? From about kindergarten up until 3rd grade, I rode the school bus. You want to know what made me stop riding the school bus? Me and Seth Shalasky in the back seat of the bus flipping off people out the window. And I was a rotten kid. Anybody else with me? Just in case you were curious, your preacher is a sinner, okay? Got it. Now, I got in trouble for that. But my parents didn't find out immediately. They didn't find out the day of. You know how they found out? My mom was working out or going on a walk or something with one of the bus drivers that I flipped off in the back of the bus. And then I'm at home alone after school one day, about a week later, and there's a phone call on the home phone. I pick it up. Hey, hello. And my mom says, hey, Clayton, this is your mother. I just talked to so-and-so. And I said, oh, gotcha. Got that guilt feeling. Started bawling my eyes out. I got home, parents spanked me, made me write a note to the bus drivers, made me go apologize, the whole 9 yards, right? You know what I'm talking about? That guilt is guilt produces fear in us. Whenever I feel that guilty feeling, whenever I know my parents know that I did wrong, I was afraid of my father, right? That's not necessarily a good thing because the guilt comes from sinning in the wrong way. Now here's Genesis 3:8. Here's what we do whenever we feel guilty. Here's what we do when we know we've done wrong. It's the same thing that Adam and Eve do. They heard the sound of the Lord, God, walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord, God among the trees of the garden. They know they did wrong, and they know somebody's coming. They feel guilty. I got to get out of here. I'm going to get spanked. I got to get out of here. I don't want to experience that. I need to get somewhere else. The number one way we deal with our fears is the same way that Adam and Eve do. We run away. We hide. We avoid it at all costs. We get out of the way. And that's what we see. Again, look at verses 10 and 11 now. After Adam and Eve, they hide, God comes in, and he says, hey, where are you? And then Adam said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. I was guilty, and that guilt caused me to be afraid of you because I am guilty, and so I hid myself. And verse 11, God said, who told you that you were naked? Did you eat of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? And they answered that, yeah, pretty much, definitely did. Anybody else realize that this fear, it comes from being guilty? I wouldn't have any fear if I wasn't wrong, right? Because I know I'm wrong, then I am afraid of the consequences of what happens to me. So that's the bad thing. That's what is not good about fear. But here's this good thing that happens with fear. It derives grace. It brings about grace. Whenever I'm afraid, whenever I'm repentant, whenever I am humble before God and recognize that I did wrong, God extends grace in the midst of my fear. That's what He does with Adam and Eve, and that's what He's going to do with us. Look at Genesis 3:15. After Adam and Eve sin, after they're guilty, after they're afraid, after they're hiding, after God confronts them with that, what does God do? He gives us the first messianic prophecy. He says, I'm going to send Jesus Christ one day, and He's going to save you. This is Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, talking to the serpent, and between your offspring and her offspring. He, talking about Jesus, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. He says, Jesus is going to destroy you, Satan. You might hurt him, but it won't be forever. We get this promise, this grace given to us in the midst of fear, in the midst of guilt, and in the midst of hiding from God. We get grace from God, undeserved grace that He extends because He wants to. Now, here's a problem with all this. Because fearing God, you know what the number one fear in the Bible is? Don't be afraid. Did you know that? Every single time an angel shows up, except for maybe one or two instances, they say, don't be afraid, because they're terrified. So how do we reconcile this? We should be afraid of God, but don't be afraid of God. Anybody else see a tension there that's not quite right? Now here's what I want to point out to you. There's two different words being used here. He says, fear God, but don't be afraid of God. Does that make sense? The fear, he's talking about awe, reverence, respect for God. And being afraid is the trembling, terrified, hiding from God. He says, you should fear God, have this awe, this reverence, this respect, this knowledge of what and who God is, but you also should not be afraid of Him because He loves you. You shouldn't be terrified of Him, that He's going to strike you down. Fear Him, but don't be afraid. And we're called to fear God, but not to be afraid. Now, I want to close with a quote from a book of C.S. Lewis, and you guys can come up and play as I read this. Now, in the book, it's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, part of the Chronicles of Narnia series. And C.S. Lewis writes the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to be an allegory, to be an illustration, to be a representation of the story of Jesus Christ and His act in our world. Okay? And so the character that represents Jesus, that represents God, is Aslan the lion. Okay? This ferocious, this mean, this terrifying lion. And we hear this little exchange between Lucy, this little girl, and another character, the beavers. And she asks, is he safe? I feel nervous about meeting a lion. And they answer, that you will, dearie. Make no mistake. If there is anyone who can appear before Aslan the lion without their knees knocking, they are either braver than most or plain silly. And then she asks, well, then is he safe? And the response is, safe? Who said anything about being safe? Of course he is not safe, but he is good. And that's the kind of respect, the kind of fear, and the kind of love we should have for God. One last quote before I let you go. Oswald Chambers, he says this, when you fear God and you fear nothing else, if you do not fear God, then you fear everything else. If you fear God, then you fear nothing else. But if you do not fear God, then you fear everything else. God is to be feared, but He is good. Do you fear God?